going to introduce our final panel of the day now. I'll introduce the moderator, and she'll introduce the participants. This is a panel on the social life of food. The moderator is our distinguished professor, Elinor Ochs, who directed the UCLA Center on the Everyday Lives of Families, which was a 10-year project funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. The aim was to document how American working parents and their children sustain their families, and this was an extraordinary project that has produced rich understandings of the nature of work and relationships in middle-class America in the present day. So I'll turn it over to our final panel. Thank you.
Okay, so good late afternoon to everyone. It's just fantastic to stand up here and see this room filled. The California room is huge, and it goes back a long way, and there is standing room only. It's wonderful to see so many friends of our discipline. So we began this afternoon with such a wonderful panel on crime, and I want to commend my colleagues on that panel. Wasn't that great? I think they deserve another round of applause. It's really fantastic. So, you know, we folks on the second panel, we've been kind of amping up our mojo to kind of, you know, be as good, at least. So our panel is on something a little bit different from crime, and it has to do with food, and in particular on the social life of food. And so I want to just say just something very briefly about the kinds of things that we're interested in on this panel. So along with language, food is at the very top of the list as an important symbol of who we are, not just as a society, but who we are as a person. And a lot of times people say we are what we eat. Food production and consumption, including diffusion and circulation of food, has fueled different kinds of food economies with very important political, social, and health implications. And our panel today is investigating these topics, and we are covering a breadth of insights into the social life of food. So first, we draw from archaeological residues to talk about the transformation of an animal or a plant into a food artifact. Think about that. That's something phenomenal. And the ecological and socio-political consequences of consumption patterns over very long stretches of time. We then consider the profound effects of globalization on local foodways, and alternatively, the effects of food on globalization, looking at globalization through the lens of food, across the New World, across Europe, and across Asia. Moving on to matters of health, we consider food insecurities and obesity as concerns accompanying the rise of capitalism and consumer individualism in developing countries such as China. And finally, we move from the far corners of the globe to our own backyard to look at the American middle class, at families, and look at our love-hate relationship with eating together as a family at dinner time. So our panel is organized a bit differently from the first panel you had today. We are going to speak individually for about 10 minutes, very generally, and one after another, and then we are leaving open time for a discussion from you, the audience. Before turning to the individual members of our fine panel, I wanted to introduce them very briefly. You have their bio sketches in your programs. But first up is Thomas Wake, known as Tom. Hi, Tom. Who is a wonderful adjunct professor of anthropology and very appreciated researcher at the Coates Institute of Archaeology here at UCLA. Tom specializes in zooarchaeology. Now, I want to tell you, when I first saw this word, I thought it might be zooarchaeology, but you know, that has different kinds of implications. But it's zooarchaeology. He's also a specialist in the relation of zooarchaeology to foodways, to the archaeology of coastlines in the Americas. So his presentation today is going to draw upon his insights into these various themes that he has garnered from fieldwork in many places. He may focus on one of those, but he has carried out fieldwork in California, in Peru, in Mexico, in Guatemala, and Panama. Okay, next up will be my dear colleague Akhil Gupta, who is professor of anthropology and and he is also, you know, he has many hats, but with one of the hats, he's also director of the UCLA Center for India and South Asia, known as CISA. His areas of interest include ethnography of information technology. He's doing a multi-year big project in Bangalore on this topic. He's also been pursuing throughout his career an interest and work on the state and development, on anthropology of food. He teaches a sold-out course on the anthropology of food, on environmental anthropology, animality, space and place, and his focus is on India and South Asia, as you might expect from a director of the Center for India and South Asia. So he is going to draw upon this creative mix of pursuits in his presentation today. Then we are going to have our industrious colleague Yunshan Yan. Also professor of anthropology and also aware of many hats. And his other really big hat is as director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA. So Yunshan's presentation today is going to draw upon his research on so many topics. It's amazing how many topics Yunshan has pursued, and I'm just going to list a few of them here: family, inequality, social change, globalization, consumerism, morality, remaking the self, and individualization of Chinese society. And then I'm going to kind of be the tail of the panel, and you'll hear from me then. Thank you. So, okay, so now we gotta get Tom's slideshow. Good.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Elinor for inviting me to sit on this panel. And what I'd like to do today is basically tell you a story about, the past 20 years of my life or so that I've spent off and on examining animal remains from this part of the world. Specifically, well, I'll be talking primarily about this part of the world, the Soconusco coast of Chiapas and Guatemala, Panama, and elsewhere in Mexico. I've been interested okay. Is that better? Better, better, better? Then I turn my head. Okay. Is that better? Okay. And it keeps slipping down on me. As I mentioned, I've been interested in the intersection between animals and human society for a long time. And I really enjoy the diversity of information that examining animal remains from archaeological sites can provide in terms of understanding past foodways and I'm joking. Old school. Yeah. Okay. Is that better? Sorry, sound man. Anyway, I'm a zooarchaeologist, and at heart, I study the animal remains from archaeological sites and try to understand how humans and those animals interacted in the past. And one of my main concerns is how did people go about getting the food that they need to survive? Because if you don't have anything to eat, you're going to starve. So one of the most basic human drives is finding that food. And animals represent animals represent the data that I study, and that includes shells, bones, and other objects. Animals were particularly important all over the world, but particularly important in this part of the world, as evidenced by their depiction in carvings and art in the formative period of Abaktakalik and Izapa to later formative period sites. It's very clear that crocodiles, toads, and other animals depicted in their art had a symbolic importance to them above and beyond the dietary importance. And we do find crocodile and toad in a lot of these assemblages. I'm going to talk about a span of time, so I want to take a trip back about 5,000 years and set the stage for talking about formative period Soconusco, which is about the last 2,000 years BC. So we'll go to the Archaic first and look at some results that I've come up with concerning diet and society of pre-agricultural peoples from 5,000 to 1800 BC at these three highlighted sites and some others in the area. And then I'll move on to a later swath of time. People at this period, in the Archaic period, were living on the food remains, actually living on top of the food remains that they harvested from estuaries like this. Most of the sites from this region, from the Archaic period, are large shell heaps. And these shell heaps sometimes are up to 10 meters deep. So there's often a good time depth, and some of these shell heaps have 3,000 years of antiquity to draw on. And I should add that the resources that you could get from this kind of estuary are diverse. You have aquatic resources, fish, shellfish, birds, lizards, iguanas, and all sorts of mammals that trundle through the swamp. It's a very zoologically diverse area. Now, to begin the story, I just want to show you a fairly technical slide, and I'll explain this, I hope, to your liking. This is a depiction of the trophic level of the fish at the site of Tlacuachero over time. And on the right side of the slide is deep time, so about 5,000 years ago, and the left side is more recent time, say 3,000 years later. And over this period of time, the trophic level of the fishery declined almost a whole trophic level point. Now, what is the point of saying that? Well, basically, the fishery, or the fish that these people were catching, reduced in quality from higher trophic level predatory fish that are tasty, that we like to make ceviche out of, corvina, that bite on hooks, that are big and fun to catch. They reduced the numbers of those fish, and we're left with a fishery that was depleted and had to change their fishing methods and had to change how they went about where exactly they fished and what kind of fish they fished for. This is another way of demonstrating that switch. The blue line represents tasty, large, predatory fish. Early, again, is at the right side of the slide. And red represents some fish that I'll show you later that are primary producers, smaller, less tasty, less desirable, And it appears that during the Archaic period, people did what people have repeated all over the world in these similar situations, which is knocked out the tasty, desirable species by overfishing them, and then they've had to switch up and figure out a way to subsist and survive by changing methods and switching to a different or focusing on a different species. These are the artifacts that show pretty clearly that they were fishing for fish with big mouths that are predatory, that bite on hooks. Turtle shell circular fish hooks from Cerro de las Conchas, and bone J-shaped fish hooks from Paso de la Amada in the formative period indicate that line fishing for these large predatory fish continued. But during the Archaic period, this fish in particular suffered a great deal under the depredations of its being so good. I mean, this is the best fish this is the fish you want for ceviche. This is the fish you want to grill. It's a white corvina. It also gets quite large, a meter or so in length. And based on analysis of head bones, a specific head bone of this fish over time at Tlacuachero, the size of this individual head bone, the otolith, reduced significantly over time, over 2 meters of excavation depth, basically 6 meters, well, 6.5 meters to 4.5 meters, which turns out to be a time span of only about 200 to 300 years. So in 200 to 300 years, these people fished this fish heavily, and what they did is, I did some calculations, and the size reduction, the mean size reduction in the otolith relates to otoliths reduced, I don't know if you can even see the pointer. The otolith length reduced 5 millimeters. That translates to a fish reduction length of 10 to 15 centimeters, which that's potentially enough size reduction, enough age class reduction to deflate this fishery. If the size, well, fish size is directly related to reproductive ability, and if they were fishing fish that couldn't reproduce, the fishery collapses. And that appears to be what happened here. This slide shows a section through time of diversity of vertebrates, well, diversity of fisheries at a series of sites. And one thing I want to emphasize is that there's this crash in diversity in the late Archaic at the transition to agriculture, or at the beginning of the formative period. Earlier in the Archaic, there's high fish diversity. They overfish their resources. They knock out the big, tasty fish and are forced to focus on a few primary producer species that are less desirable. Then the transition to agriculture happens, but it didn't happen overnight. It happened over hundreds or thousands of years, really, of innovative development. But in this region, ceramics and increasing corn use show up about beginning 1800 BC and progress through the formative period. And looking at some of these sites, I could go on ad nauseum, but I'm not going to. So one of the things about the transition to agriculture that is interesting is that in this region, it was slow and stepwise. It wasn't miraculous. It wasn't like, oh, we've got corn, now we can do whatever we want. It took a while. And the archaic form of food gathering, hunting for a diversity of prey, continued in time. But there's one thing that happened, and this is just an example of the swamps in the region that I actually got to go fishing with a group of men and Richard Lejour in these swamps, and we experienced firsthand what it's like to go use a seine with a group in boats and practice the fishery. And we had a great time and got good data concerning one fishing event, what species were caught where, and how they're divided up, and it was really a lot of fun and turns out very informative. But it's not just, well, and this is the beauty that's, I think, one of the cornerstone sustainable fish species in the region that I don't have enough time to talk about now, but I want to hint at sustainability because these fish are primary producers. They're the ones that helped the people in the late Archaic survive that overfishing, and they're still used today. But this slide concerns the frequency of dogs and deer in formative period assemblages, starting with early formative period here at Paso de la Mata to later formative period. All are BC, but over about 1,000 years, there are two things that I want to point out in this chart, and this is the last chart. First of all, there's a gradual to radical increase in the relative frequency of dog amongst all mammal remains at these sites through time, which indicates to me that people began to intensify the use of dogs as a food resource through the formative period, but especially in the later formative, the middle to late formative era. And also, in the early formative, dogs and deer represent only about 10% of the total mammal species captured. So there's a continuation of the archaic pattern of going after a diversity of species that continues gradually, well, that decreases gradually as dogs and deer become more important through time. And I think that's indicative of the pace of the development of the domestication, really, of the domestication of the people in this region. It took time for agriculture to become productive enough to support a growing population. And once that population became large enough that they needed to expand their protein resources, they began to eat more and more dogs. And I've had dog, and it's tasty if it's cooked right. So just a comment or two on the transition to agriculture in the Soconusco. It took a while. But in this region, like all other regions of the world where there was a transition to agriculture, it's of paramount importance to the survival of our species. And it gets back at really how are we supposed to gather enough food to survive? Hunter-gatherers did it differently. Somebody figured out that you could exploit plants and manipulate plants, and combining the two is basically what has gotten us to where we are today. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And now we are going to go to Akhil Gupta. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here today. So today I will talk about food and globalization. And what I want to do is I want to begin by telling you a little bit about this class that I teach on the anthropology of food. So when the first year I taught it, it had, I think, I don't know, 50 or 60 students. And then I've been teaching it for the 8 years that I've been here. And the last time I taught it, there were 350 students in the class. It just keeps growing. And one year I taught it 3 times in the same year. And I had over 200 students each quarter that I taught the class. So there's a huge demand for this. It's given rise to a whole discipline, a whole field of scholarly inquiry that's called food studies. Some of you may have heard of this. And the reason why food is such a good topic is that we can, through food, understand a lot of different themes or topics in anthropology. So, for example, Elinor is going to talk to you about kinship, how through food you can understand kinship and the dynamics of families. This is a central topic in anthropological study. It's very important for understanding religion. So all religions prohibit the consumption of certain kinds of foods in certain periods, and enable others, and distinguish themselves from other religions by what people will eat and will not eat. Similarly, the question of identity is centrally tied to food. So whether we think about ethnic identity, or we think of national identity, or if you think of immigrant identities, identities are forged by the consumption of certain kinds of foods, and equally by the non-consumption of others. Think about food and social inequality, right? So the difference between, there's a whole very, very interesting history of the rise of table manners and the construction of cultural capital through food. Food is very important for gender, for the construction of gender and gender inequality. So certain kinds of foods are labeled as foods that are fit for women and certain for men, or more likely to be consumed by women and more likely to be consumed by men. And I point out to my students that in the US, the particular coding that we use doesn't translate very well to other contexts, right? So salad and white meat for women and red meat for men. Often that's not what happens, say, if you go to Japan. You won't find the same kind of coding. Food and sexuality. Food is a great way to think about sexuality and how sexual identities and mannerisms and mores are constructed. Again, in terms of aesthetics and aesthetic judgment. So I always ask students, why are you taking this class? And a lot of them, I would say the majority of them say, it's because I watch a lot of food shows, right? And so there's a huge rise in this whole genre of shows that teach you how to consume food, how to appreciate good food, etc. Right? So it's all about forming aesthetic judgment. Again, food is connected to public health problems. So the stuff about that we hear all around us about obesity, diabetes, and this is again one of the major issues major reasons why students take the class is because they're interested in health and nutrition. Body image issues, through food we can talk about taboos, etc. Through food, we can also shed light on some very important historical dynamics that have shaped the West today, that have shaped the world today, I would say. Themes such as colonialism and slavery were absolutely central to the story of food. So what I want to do is to think about food and globalization and ask the question of, I'm trying to see how to move this along. Maybe I'm too close. I don't know what's happening. What did you do?
Button.
This one. Okay. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll just present to you some images, and you have to guess what unifies these images, right? And I'll keep talking, and I'll just transition through these images. So I want to use it to think about globalization. So in the last 25 years, we've heard a lot about how the world is getting smaller, how people are more globally connected. There are more global flows of commodities and people and so forth. Things are moving more easily than before. Images, ideas, those kinds of things. And in the case of food, of course, what this means is the availability of a larger range of foods from all over the world, right? You've all experienced the phenomenon of these these foods that come up that are supposed to be like important foods that somehow are the healthy foods of the moment, right? And we keep cycling through those foods. But in general, the availability of tropical foods, for example, has changed dramatically. So in 1975, when I first came to the United States, there were very few tropical fruits and vegetables, except for bananas, pineapples maybe, that were available in most grocery stores. If you go to grocery stores today, you'll find a huge range of fruits and vegetables, some of which you may not even know anything about, how to eat them, how to cook them, etc. And all of this has happened in a relatively short period of time. It's happened basically the last 20 to 30 years. There's also the rise of fusion cuisines. There is the global diffusion of fast food chains. All of this points to the relationship between food and globalization. And Yunsheng will say a little more about both the diffusion of fast food, but also about the health problems associated with them. Now, in the scholarly literature, there is, however, a deep skepticism about how much globalization is, in fact, a recent phenomenon. So there are two basic camps on this. One camp points out that globalization really has a very long history, and not much has changed recently, although we made a huge fuss about globalization in the present. It's really not anything new. It's been happening for a long time. And basically, the story of the world is a story of the continuation of processes of globalization that have a very long history. The other position on this is that, of course, things have, in fact, changed in recent years with globalization, but the changes are not unusual, in the sense that there have changes that have occurred in specific domains, like financial flows, information flows, et cetera. But in fact, if you looked at other phenomena, you would find that globalization's history goes well beyond what has happened in the last 25 years. And if you look at food, you get a sense of that long history, right? So this is what my slides have been referring to, is been referring to this long history of globalization by looking at food. Now, the history of food demonstrates that one watershed moment in globalization occurred with the Columbian Exchange. That is, the Columbian Exchange is named after Christopher Columbus, the explorer, and which is the use of New World crops in cuisines all over the world, right? So most people would have guessed that that's the theme going through the slides. Every image you saw here was an image which used some materials from another part of the world through trade relations. In this case, it's pepper, right? Cinnamon, Swedish cinnamon cookies. Cinnamon comes mostly from Sri Lanka. Here you have Chinese food with New World crops, pineapple, cashews, and chilies, all come from the New World. Tomato, the tomato comes from the New World, right? Here you have a Thai curry with red and green chilies and peanuts, all come from the New World. And this is an Indian chili preparation. And to most Indians, if you told them that the chili is not indigenous to India, and people did actually use it very long ago, they would firmly deny it, and they'll say, no, you don't know your history, right? But the fact is that chilies have been used in Indian cooking only for the last 300 to 400 years, which may not be only, but it's only 1/10 of the period in which Indian civilization has existed. So for 9/10 of that period, people did not use chilies. They used black pepper to cook their food. Similarly, if you look at a place like the Caribbean or the Malay Straits, areas which had long trade influences, you'll see that there is a long history of food from different parts of the world that comes together and forms a part of the local diet, right? And now this is not a continuous history. It is a discontinuous history, right? In the sense that things happen at particular moments, then there may not be the same rapid change going on all the time, and then at another moment there might be another big shift that happens, right? It's discontinuous for another reason as well, which is that, and I'll end with this point, that globalization is historically deep, it's uneven, it's contradictory, but it means very different things to different people according to where you are. So if you told somebody from a US perspective, you went and said, oh, you got all these new foods that are coming in, and it's a great moment, etc. They would say, well, we've had new foods coming in for 400 years. I mean, there's nothing new about this at the present moment. And of course, and I'll end with this point. This is a Japanese-Peruvian fusion, right? So again, things that are fairly typical in LA at the moment, but not things that you would see. Okay, so these are some of the trade routes that show how it traveled from the New World. And this is my point about unequal and discrepant globalization, that globalization in the pursuit of foodstuffs, pepper played a central role in colonization. The sugar played a critical role in slavery. Sugar and of course, a non-food item like cotton played a central role in slavery. So just by following the trajectory of food, one could actually tell very many interesting stories about globalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Akhil. And our next presentation is going to be by Yunshan Yan. And going to turn the floor over to him. Yunshan, do you want to use this? Okay, do you want to stand here? It's this button here.
That goes forward.
This button here.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to join my colleagues to thank all of you for coming to this occasion. And secondly, I want to make just a few notes to this talk. Number one, although I did almost all my research in China, on China so far, but this one is about America. It's about our society here, because my dream project is to study American democracy as a moral system. And but something interesting always keep happening in China, just dragging me over there. So I definitely want to do it, and this is the beginning. And secondly, one thing about American democracy as a moral system is that people so much get used to agree to disagree. So there's anything you mention, there are different opinions. So that's another thing I want to, later on when I presented them, and I want to say it out and loud in first. So lastly, anthropology is very much closely related to contemporary life. Because the goal, the mission of anthropology, for most of us, in the sociocultural subfield at least, is to study how culture being used as a way of life for people to adapt a particular environment, and then to survive and thrive. Since our current contemporary world is changing so fast, and that way of life is changing as well. So one thing you have to keep pace with the change is to really keep a sharp eye observing what is going on in your life. One thing I observed is so that many people nowadays, especially in this society, are into food. And as Akhil just mentioned, 350 students enrolled in his class. And also, so many people nowadays self-claim themselves as foodie. I think that's a new word, probably. In many traditional societies, probably not so far ago in time in America, being so much into food, you should be shameful. You should be very much concentrated on work instead of food. That says something about the changing ethics of our society, doesn't it? So that's why I'm going to talk about another thing on my observation is I asked quite a number of foodies, self-claimed foodies, how do you define foodie? And a lot of people answered, I know what I not only know how to appreciate the food, but know what is good, what is healthy, how to pick. So they know all the food dangers as a good foodie. Therefore, I want to talk about the food dangers, health scare, and consumerism as we show in the title. First, I want to pose a question here to the audience. Since when food become a dangerous thing? Right? Tom just gave us a presentation. For such a long time, food has been such a precious thing for people to pursue. Since when it becomes dangerous, and why? And then the danger comes from all different sources. Right? You have bacteria, you have antibiotics, other kind of food additives, colorings, flavors, and then genetic modified foods, all those kind of things. And also, we know clearly food is dangerous because it can damage our health. Therefore, we want to be extra careful and cautious, so much so that cooking becomes a scientifically designed process. We want to measure everything, control the temperature, all those things, having all the experts' advice to be followed. And we judge our food by health benefits instead of a taste. He says one of the benefits of eating cherries is to here, not only improve your immunity, but relieves pain. I don't know how it works, relieve your pain. And we do so for a good reason or not. Because you wanted to improve your health, avoid danger, not to add sugar, but you add sweetener instead. Think about all the iced tea. And also, the scares and the caution are well-grounded if we remember SARS, which started with food consumption. And it is really scary because of globalization, right? And beef is dangerous as well. So dangerous that we better to eat chicken. The question is chicken more safe or safer? If you remember this, right? And then, although the expert kept saying human infection rate out of a bird flu is low, we are equally scared because of all the number of reasons mentioned above, especially the globalization factor. And food dangers also comes from the modern ways of food production, food transportation, trading, packaging, all these things related to our modern way of life. These poor chicks, they live in this cage in the entire lifespan. They never move. They produce more than 300 eggs a year if they are hens, or if they are being there for meat, in 4 to 6 weeks, they are at our dinner table, several pounds heavy, right? And we wanted to switch to seafood. Most of the seafood are produced on farms with additives because the farmers want to prevent disease or those things to happen to these heavily crowded species. Therefore, it is fully understandable that we panic out of from health scares over food dangers, even though the actual factor of danger may be small, but the social effects are larger, much larger, and getting larger and larger. Therefore, we want to point somebody to be blamed. Finger pointing is what we do the best. Right? However, I wonder, have we ever pointed that finger to ourselves? think about our responsibilities in the whole range of issues of food safety, right? For instance, why do we need 180 choices of soft drinks? They keep saying it's low calories, no risk, but at least you can see it has flavoring added, right? It has coloring added. Why not just clear water? Because we want our individual right to be happy and picky. That's the core of individualism, and a particular kind of individualism I want to point out is consumer individualism. The whole message of a consumer individualism delivered is you as individual deserve to have all your desires to be satisfied instantly, right here and now. Back to individualism. There's the other side. Individual responsibilities and the choices to be disciplined and to do the right thing. Now, back to fast food case. We always blame fast food. Here, early this year, January 5th, the Time magazine reported a case, a very interesting case. This is a science teacher in Iowa who went on for McDonald's diet 3 times a day for 3 months, and he lost 37 pounds. He ate salad in the morning. He ate, eggs in the morning, salad in the noon for lunch, and the typical Big Mac for dinner, and followed by dessert. Plus 40 minutes walk every day. Therefore, he said the true thing is smart choice. It's not about fast food. And I would confirm his point because I did a research long time ago in 2005 about obesity among Chinese children. This kid weighs more than 62 kilos. The first suspect is fast food. McDonald's entered into China in the late 1990s. But this neighborhood is a poor neighborhood. The parents cannot even afford McDonald's. McDonald's is the middle class thing in China at that time. What they had is just to keep feeding their kids more and more as a sign of a parental love, and mostly grandparental love because they are taking care of their grandparents. And meanwhile, restrict the kids' time of playing and moving around, exercise, forcing them to concentrating on study, getting a better, higher scores. So it works both sides. More food, less exercise. It's out of a parental love. So I'm finishing. Here is the final remarks. Number one, all of these, I think nothing new. It's all truisms. But what I found interesting is that to put them together is kind of scary. Food danger, I think, is a modern concept. For a long, long time, human race has been worried mostly about the shortage of food. If we go out of America today, there are still parts of the world where people are worried about the shortage of food. So food safety issues goes both ways. We have it one way. People in other societies have some other problems. And food danger prompts a health scare, and health scare basically change our way of life, so much so even change our identity, and we forget who we are if we worry too much about health and too much about food dangers. I decided not to show the slides. I got the images of these people in what they call eating disorder. It becomes really, really bad, and they're so thin, almost like a ghost. And most food issues, I would argue, deserve from modern ways of food production, circulation, so on and so forth. However, if you think why we have the modern ways of food production, circulation, all this, because we want the best, easier to get, best looking, best tasting, and also all season around food that we desire. Therefore, we have anti-season growing, we have long-distance transportation, we have modern ways of pre-packaged, pre-cooked, all those things. It's because we want them. Therefore, I would argue at the core is the rise of a consumer individualism, which relates to the contemporary ethical change from being good to feeling good. Feeling good is all we want. That's the core of consumerism. Being good is hard because you have to discipline yourself according to certain exterior criteria, right? And therefore, I think finally, as anthropologists always do, let's say almost similar thing in different ways, food safety issues are part of ongoing social cultural transformation. That is quickly, this is the last few words might be new. It's quickly spreading the entire world because consumer individualism is something. Once you have it, you cannot afford not having it. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Yunshan. When I heard what Yunshan was going to talk about, I burst out and said, we have to write a paper together. Okay, so I'm going to go up to the top here. Whoops, no, to the very top here. Okay. Great. I would like to test. Can we test to see? No? Okay. I have to go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about us. I'm going to talk, and you're going to hear some themes that Yunshan brought up come back at a very local, personal level here. So I'm going to talk about how middle-class families in the United States either eat together or don't. But first, I want to talk about Samoa, where I did fieldwork on children's language development and childhood a while ago. And I'm talking about Samoa because in Samoa, and looking at early childhood, one of the things that's really striking is how important it is for children to attempt to get food for themselves. And one of the very first words that children use is a word that means poor me, and it's used to beg for food. Children do not assume that they are going to get food beyond nursing, and they usually eat food after people who are older or higher status eat food. Okay, and here is I'm going to show you an example of the way in which children prepare and serve food for their elders before they eat. So, okay. Follow the little girl in pink who just sat down, and then her mother tells her, you better get up, clean up. She gets up again. Okay, so now I want to switch to what's going on down the street from UCLA. And I want to show you one household of a number of households that are centered on everyday lives of families studied. Oops, but before I do that, whoops, oh, that's interesting. Oh, let me see. Okay. Well, I wanted to show you something, but it didn't show up. But here is I just wanted to have a photograph here of our center on the Everyday Lives of Families, which was an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and it ran from 2001 to 2010. And we looked at middle-class families in Los Angeles at the beginning of the 21st century. And we were an interdisciplinary team who studied 32 families, and these families all had working parents, and the families had elementary school age kids, 2 or 3 of them. And we had, in in the anthropology realm, we had archaeologists, we had medical anthropologists, psychocultural medical anthropologists, we had linguistic anthropologists. So we covered a lot of the different subdisciplines of anthropology. We also worked very closely together with clinical psychologists, with sociologists, with researchers in education and some other fields. But we all worked together on the same 32 families, and we did a lot of different kinds of things. We video recorded the families a week in the life of these 32 families. We also took almost 21,000 photographs of the way in which people's homes were filled with many, many different objects. And that told us about the material worlds of families. We also did timed observations of families, very in-depth ethnographic interviews with parents and with children about health, about social routines, about their social networks, and so on. So one of the things that a number of us concentrated on was eating. And the reason is because for middle-class families, like many other families across the globe, eating together has something of a ritual sacred status. People think in the United States, this is an old Norman Rockwell Saturday Evening Post cover, but people still have this same Norman Rockwell idea about family dinners. They think that family dinners, if you eat together with your children, that your children are not going to have drugs, they're not going to smoke, they're not going to get fat, there are lots of different things are not going to happen if you eat together. But at the same time, people are bemoaning, families, parents are bemoaning the fact that they can't always eat together. And in fact, our families very, very rarely did eat all together as a family. Now, the reason that they give for this is mostly that they're extremely busy. And it is true. Working parents are really incredibly busy. Working parents work long, they work hard. When people get home, they're really exhausted, and so it becomes really very difficult to have dinner together. But there are also lots of other reasons that we have seen and others have seen. So for example, it's very difficult if people are away from home. And we know, for example, that dads work 2 hours longer than the working moms in our family studies, so being away from the home could be important. But one of the things we found is even when every single person is at home, they still weren't eating together as a family, all together as a family. So there has to be something else. It can't just be that they're away from home, and it also can't just be that people are too busy if they're all in the same house at the same time. Another idea was, oh, maybe it is the time of dinner, and that really does have some resonance. Americans tend to eat pretty early compared to the rest of the world, and we know from our study, our timed tracking observations that the archaeologists did of where every family member was every 10 minutes, what activity they were doing, what artifacts they were using to do that activity, and so on. We know that the fathers were home, most of the fathers were home by 7 o'clock. The moms usually came home around 5 o'clock. You know, why is it that Americans tend to have dinner before 7 o'clock? Why don't Americans wait until after 7 o'clock to have dinner when everybody could be home together more frequently? Long work hours, well, that is something I mentioned just before. That could be something that could be really incredibly important. But we found actually it wasn't that important, that a lot of people who had shorter, really long work hours still managed to come home for dinner because it was really a priority. And people who had short work hours didn't necessarily come home. So long work hours in itself is not something that was important. And then there's what is down here on the right-hand corner, individual pursuits. And I think that that is something we want to talk about a little bit more. And this also connects to Yun Chun's talk about individualism. It is also the case that people have homework to do, kids have homework to do, or they have the video games, or they want to watch a television program. The parents are very involved in their own activities. So there are a lot of individual pursuits that are going on in the house, and of course the house is divided up into rooms, unlike other places in the world, and so there's a lot of architecture that protects and where individuals can thrive in doing these pursuits by themselves, and why not just eat and do those things on your own. Okay, so those are a lot of things that lots of people have talked about and that we have affirmed in our study as well. But there's another stealth factor that I would like to layer on here, and that has to do with the relation of all these things to what you eat, and particularly eating what some people call convenience foods, some people call pre-prepared foods, and other people just called packaged foods or prepackaged foods. Okay, so when we looked and took all these 21,000 photographs, one of the things we found is that homes are stuffed with food. There's a tremendous amount of food stockpiling in the house, and a large quantity of that food are packaged foods of this sort, and they're individualized. A lot of them are individualized packets of food, like you can see the individualized packets of cookies that were on the floor of a kitchen that could be maybe for lunch, but also could be picked up by the kids during the late afternoon. The refrigerator is stuffed with packaged foods. The freezers, I often wonder why Americans have such big freezers. Well, in case you're interested, it's not because they're putting turkeys in there so much as they're putting big boxes of food from Costco and other big supermarkets, and boxes take up a lot of space, and so they're pizzas, and there are all these different kinds of little treats, and children get these treats after school, you know, like your mother always said, maybe for many mothers of people in this room, you know, don't snack, but snacking is ubiquitous, and a lot of the snacks are these pre-prepared foods. Sorry, I'm going to show now a mother showing what is inside the refrigerator, and it's Linda Garrow, who's in the room, who was part of our project, is the interviewer there. This is part of the health interview we did. We asked people to open the refrigerators and talk about the things that were inside the refrigerator as part of understanding family health. And in the middle of that interview, the two of the three kids from the family came up and wanted snacks. Here it goes.
Can I have these Go-Gurts? Yogurts? Sure.
Oh yeah, I guess we have a vote of confidence for those.
Stuff from your heart. Yay, strawberry!
Okay.
Okay, so one of the little girls got a strawberry yogurt, and then the other girl got a Go-Gurt. And just to point out, apropos of Yun Chan's talk, that Go-Gurts have more sugar than a serving of Coca-Cola. But okay. Okay, now moving on. One of the things we found through the archaeological studies that were done, especially by Margaret Beck, who was a postdoc in our center, was she did a very careful analysis of what people prepared for dinner, and she found that only a third of the dinners were home-cooked from raw ingredients, and you can see that 32% part of the pie there on top, of foods from scratch, and the rest were either some or entirely of these convenience foods, or were takeout, or people went to a restaurant. Okay, one of the other things that Margaret found out is that even though people say that they're very busy, that there was actually only 10 minutes difference between preparing the convenience foods and preparing the food, the raw ingredients from the start, just preparing things from scratch. Now, it has been pointed out to me that for some people, 10 minutes is a very, very long time. Like if I go on a treadmill, 10 more minutes is a long, long time. So, you know, maybe, you know, for some people, 10 more minutes of cooking is a very, very long time. So I'm understanding the existential nature of, you know, 10 minutes. But in the realm of time, 10 minutes is not a lot of time. I don't think that most people in this room would think 10 minutes is a lot of time. So one of the things, the clinical psychologists who were on our team, they looked at the video recordings that we did, and they looked at the intensity and the kind of emotion that were displayed at every 10 minutes for a certain segment of time. They looked at that. And when you look at the start of dinners, children in 70% of the families had a display of disgust or unhappiness. So part of it could be that they're just reluctant to come to the table because, you know, they've eaten already, you know, a lot of high fructose or whatever snacks. But a lot of it, from looking at the transcripts and looking at the video, we know that most of the foods that are served are these convenience foods. And parents think that kids love these kinds of foods, like burritos and different kinds of things. But actually, there's a problem with these kinds of foods. And the problem is that when you get something that's frozen, it's all stuck together. You can't, when you cook something from scratch, you know, if Johnny doesn't like peppers, you can take the peppers out. But when you have something that is all there and it's packaged, it's just like, that's it. That's it. And the kids are like picking things out and they don't like it and they whine. And so there's a lot of tension at the table anyway. That's another talk. But this convenience food fuels a lot of the kind of distaste. And I just want to give you one little excerpt of an excerpt that has to do with packaged soup, where the mom goes, "Oh, you took the celery out of the soup? You took the celery out too?" And the kid goes, "I don't like it in it. I don't want carrots." That was another thing he said. And then, "I'm taking out all the stuff I don't like." And he just put his fingers inside the broth and is picking out all the vegetables in the soup. Okay. So I'm about to finish here, but I also want to say that I looked at, I was curious to see what do people eat when they're together, when they do, for the families that do eat together, and what do people eat when they are eating on the run or eating in different places in the room, like a child looking at television and eating, or whatever people are doing. And one of the really striking things, and it makes perfect sense, is that when people are eating apart, when families are eating apart, they're eating mostly convenience foods. It makes sense. You can just pick it up and go. You know, pop it into the microwave and go. When people are eating together, they tend to be, most of the meals eaten together were meals made from scratch. Maybe it's because it's a bigger deal. Maybe it's because, you know, it's something that is going to be appreciated by other people. I'm not sure. But it's raw ingredients, and eating together seem to correlate. Eating alone and eating these kinds of convenience foods also seems to correlate. So one of the things it's been on my mind is, you know, the ways in which these prepackaged foods may afford or influence or propel this kind of eating apart. I mean, it goes both ways, obviously, but there's something about it, about this kind of individualism. And it's something I think that is very silent. It's not necessarily, even though there is a lot of attention to nutrition, I think in families, people don't think about this. They don't think, they want so desperately their children to be together with them at the parents do at the table, but they don't realize that what they're eating is the very thing that may pull them apart. And then, so I want to just end by saying, does eating apart matter? I mean, or does eating together matter? And the answer is, you know, both no and yes. It's no, of course not. It doesn't really matter if there are other moments for the family to be all together. When we saw the Samoan families, they don't eat together, but they are together so much. They're within visual and oral access of each other. They see each other almost all day long, except for some moments when people are doing work or when the kids are at school. But yes, it does matter if these kinds of moments of being together are rare. If being all together as a family is rare, then it is really very important, because dinner in this society in the 21st century is one of the very few moments when there is this opportunity to be together and to share a meal. In our tracking observations that the archaeologists did, we found that only 14% of our 32 families, 14% of the timed observations of these 32 families, in only 14% of those observations, when every single family member was at home, were they together in the same room. And some families were never together, all together in the same room. So thank you. Okay, so now the floor is open for discussion. We're running a little bit late, but we would love to talk with you. There's some mic back here. Can someone turn the individual mics back on? Can we turn the, great.
You mentioned the countries where, or cultures where dinner was later.
Yes.
Did that have a were they correspondingly more apt to eat together as families?
We did not do a study of families eating together in different countries. So I can't answer that empirically. I don't know correlation between time of eating and eating together. We only know that there would be a greater probability or possibility of eating together in the United States in middle-class family homes if people chose to eat a little bit later.
You said your families had grammar school children, right?
Yes.
So if they're eating at 7 or 7:30 and then they got to get ready for bed, it's like eat dinner and go to bed. Maybe they don't want to just do it that way. They got to get up to go to school the next morning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
it would be, you know, there's like no, I guess it's trade-offs, benefits and trade-offs. So, but there were some children who were running around in extracurricular activities and eating, you know, it could be eating quite late because they're doing extracurricular activities. There are all kinds of things that can go on, or people just eating on the run to a restaurant in between extracurricular activities. Yeah, it's a trade-off. But I mean, it's a trade-off of whether you want to have a moment during the week to be together as a family, and you would push it up, or push it later in the day for that end, or we just eat in a fragmented way. There's a hand over here.
The question is, in terms of eating, did you look at whether there was the quality of the environment in which that eating took place, so that the involvement of the adults with the children in conversation going around the table keeps children at the table as opposed to just the mechanical or biological act of shoveling food into your mouth?
I'm so glad you asked that question, since I'm a linguistic anthropologist. This doesn't directly answer you, but indirectly does. So where families were all together, where families were eating food prepared from fresh ingredients, they tended to be more together, so that had an opportunity for interaction more. And furthermore, those families had the longest dinners. So those were dinners that were more than 45 minutes. Whereas when family members ate in smaller units, part of the family ate together or people ate just by themselves, then the eating time was very short. But I also looking at the narratives, like narratives of things that happened during the day, if you look at those, the long dinners, they're just tons of narratives. People are just sharing their lives with one another. In other work that I had done 20 years earlier in the United States as well, I mean, the dinner time is a prime locus where people get to review what happened to them during the day. And I mean, it is really stressful to be apart. And we have cell phones now. It is possible for people to text and to have voice contact through that media. But really, nothing substitutes for face-to-face, sustained interaction around a topic, around something that happened to somebody, an experience, or around something that you want to do together as a family. And so I always say dinner is my only religion. It seems like such a wonderful opportunity. But I also recognize that for some families, they can do that in there's some other moment of the day that they have where that goes on. And so, it's not like one size fits all. It's just, that should go on, because we have a possibility of a intergenerational distancing if that doesn't go on.
Hey, so Dr. Wake, when agriculture was fully established in the area in which you studied, was there a change in the animal consumption? Did it decrease or increase? And if increased, then why?
Hello?